What was it that caused you to decide that this needed to be the focus of the work that you do?
I think my own journey, Matt. First of all, thank you all for being here. It's a real honor for me to be in your presence. And they've been wonderful hosts and true blessing to be in San Antonio. The traffic here is much better than Atlanta, so it's nice to be here.
It's all relative.
My own journey to faith was one of great struggle. I had a great deal of indifference towards all religious truth, as they called it, and wondered really whether it was all culturally engendered, whether people manufactured superstition and ideas to make themselves feel better. But then there are tremendous philosophical struggles to the very notion of God. So many questions come up into your mind. So my journey to commitment to Christ was a very torturous one. And because of that, and having been raised in a country which has probably produced more religions than any other nation on the face of the earth. Hinduism is India spawned, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism. You've got many of the isms from out there that talk about religious ideas. I use that term carefully. And to me, all of those couldn't possibly be true. There may be ideas that are true in some of them, but the notion of God by definition is an uncaused being, non-contingent. And that notion cannot have all these pluralities of suggestions. So when I came to know Christ, I realized in Him alone are the four questions of life: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, answered both with corresponding truths to specific questions and coherent as a worldview to answer those particular questions. That's the worldview of everybody, how you answer origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And I think only in the gospel are the particular answers corresponding to reality, and the totality of answers in their aggregate make for a coherent worldview. So that's what launched me into it. And my calling was not to go to friendly audiences, those who are going to agree with you. My calling was to go to hostile audiences, those who would disagree with you. Doesn't make for a comfortable life, but it makes for a very meaningful life, and that's why we're in those arenas.
Well, and I commend you for your courage to carry this truth to audiences that are hostile towards it, because it's the only hope that they have to receive the freedom that comes in knowing Jesus Christ. It's a wonderful thing that the church has the answer, but if we don't share the answer we have, then the world has no hope. And when you talk about your struggle of coming to faith, that was not just a philosophical struggle. It wasn't an intellectual struggle. It had very real manifestations in your own life in which you actually thought about taking your life at one point.
Yes, I did. And actually for many, many years, couldn't even talk about it, Matt, because it's not a matter to be trumpeted around. You're not proud of it. But born in India, one of the most important things about Indian culture is pride of success, especially in your education. Education is the big thing in India. And if you're not doing well, there was no future. And I was not doing well, mainly because my interest was more in sports. I was not particularly interested in books. My family used to say if you threw Ravi's book on organic chemistry into the air, it would open on the same page every time, because I never turned the pages of it. But because of that failure, it ultimately drove me to a bed of suicide. My dad was a very successful man. My brothers and sisters were very successful. I was not doing well. And so in a culture of shame vis-a-vis success, I decided to end it all at the age of 17. And it was on a bed of suicide that a Bible was brought to me. I had never opened one. I did not own one. And to find that Jesus was truly the answer to the deepest struggles of the soul, and that He provided not just propositional answers, but a relational answer. My struggle was existential, not just intellectual. And that was given to me on that bed of suicide. From John chapter 14, verse 19, Jesus said, "Because I live, you also shall live." He redefines what living actually means. Yeah.
the reason I ask you that is because there are a lot of people that they struggle with humanity. They struggle with depression. They struggle with doubt. They struggle with fear. And yet in that equation, they have a measure of faith. And with that measure of faith, one of their struggles is, if I have this faith, why am I still struggling? And I think that some of the answer is found in what you've stated about John 14 and 19, because I live, you shall also live. The challenge is really the definition that we have for life versus the definition that Christ has for our lives.
Right.
What have you found is the difference between man's definition of life and the biblical definition?
Years ago, I read a statement. Let me see if I can remember how it went. Jesus Christ continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive, and compels us to radically redefine what we mean by life. He encounters us the way he encountered the disciples on Easter Sunday. They were the ones marked out for death. He, the dead one, was really the living. So he reverses all of our definitions and gives us the true meaning of what it means to live, not just biological life, but the life of the soul, the purpose for which you and I were fashioned. So when Augustine comes to know Christ, he hears the voice, as it were, an angelic voice, or from somewhere. He was a sensually driven man. He was a man who lived for pleasure, and he heard the word telolege, take up and read. And he took to the book of Romans and started to read. And then he says, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. That rest in the bosom of the one who has designed you is the culmination of what purpose is all about.
Absolutely. So you get to carry this message to some hostile crowds. Thank God we don't have one here tonight. What are some of the places that you have gone, and what are the most difficult places to share the message of truth?
If you'd asked me this question maybe 20 years ago, when we began our ministry of Christian apologetics, and we are actually evangelists. We are described as apologists, but apologetics is really the discipline of doing two things: giving answers to people's questions and making the truth claims clear. Peter did this, Paul did this, let me explain. Always be prepared to give a reason and the answer of anyone who asks of you.
I'm glad you tell us what an apologist is, because when I went to seminary, I asked my father about apologetics, and he said, apologize for nothing.
And he was right. Right counsel for a general story in life. But the discipline of apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, to give an answer, to give a reason. And so what called me into this 20 years ago was very different, Matt. The hostility. I would be in counter perspectives, in contrary religions. I remember being in some places where there were really sharpshooters at the roof of the building and security all around me in the platform. But today, one of the most hostile nations on earth to present the gospel is in our institutes of higher learning right here in the United States. And it's become a sad story, but we have been so propagandized in education to think that Christianity strains credulity, that we believe nonsensical ideas, and that secularism really has the answers. Secularism cannot even justify its questions, leave alone find answers. What is moral reasoning about? How do we differentiate between good and bad? What is the source of all of our moral reasoning? Secularism asks these questions, but they are meaningless questions if we are the random product of time plus matter plus chance. The only reason we raise these questions is because we are made in the image of God. And part of the image of God is moral reasoning, the ability to think of right and wrong, good and evil. And so what's happened today, we discuss political ideas, not with the way we ought to. So we talk of right and left. We've forgotten there's an up and a down. Those two dimensions are very critical in defining it. So that indoctrination at the hands of so-called intellectuals has bred this kind of hostility on the campus. But, Walter Storff, the great philosopher from Yale who lost his son in a very sad hiking accident. Walter Storff is a Christian philosopher, one of the most prominent philosophers of our time. He wrote a book called Lament for a Son, when his son died in his 20s. And Walter Storff was so shaken. All of his books are dealing with philosophical ideas. This one deals with his broken heart, that he lost his son so early in life. If you haven't read it, pick up that book, Lament for a Son. You won't read it to inspire you, but you will read it to sober your thinking about life. He said, when all the chasms have been bridged, when we've learned to solve the problem of heat with air conditioning, learned to solve the problem of distance with our jet planes, and all these other problems have been solved, he said, there remain still two questions with which we struggle: the problem of evil and the problem of death. Think about it. The problem of evil with which we live and the problem of death which we all face. To those two questions, only the gospel of Jesus Christ has the answer.
Amen to that.
How to deal with sin and the hope beyond the grave.
So when you're discussing the hostility that there is on secular campuses around the country, one of the things that is ironic is that a mantra in the modern age is tolerance. We should all be tolerant. We should all choose to willingly accept each other's ideas, which seems to be certainly acceptable for every form and type of behavior, except Christianity.
Sure.
What is it about a secular world that in an age of tolerance has decided that if tolerance were a religion, Christianity would be the only forbidden behavior?
Because the Christian faith challenges us at every level of life. Pleasure, pain, success, conflict, inattentions, all of these. And the Christian faith claims exclusivity. But the fact of the matter is, all truth is exclusive. People don't realize every religion is exclusive. Islam is exclusive. Hinduism is exclusive, even though they like to tell you they're not. Hinduism will not compromise on two dogmas of theirs, the karmic cycle and reincarnation. Those two are non-negotiables. The only worldview that accepts all of them is Baha'ism, but even they exclude the exclusivists. So you cannot really have an all-inclusive faith. And so this exclusive claim is what that has been troublesome to people, but at the same time, we have to take a bit of the blame, Matt. And the bit of the blame is we have not presented this faith wisely. We have presented sometimes in a commercial way. We have presented it sometimes in a self-aggrandizing way, self-propagation. If people truly gave a hearing to Jesus Christ, they will realize that it is a message of hope. It is a message of true peace. It is a message that settles ultimate conflicts within, which is where the primary problem is. Once they understand who Jesus is and what he said, they actually get disarmed. So a caricature of the Christian faith has created a lot of these tensions. And these caricatures are best seen with how intellectuals distort what the Christian faith is all about. Let me give you one little example, all right? We listen to people mocking the miracles in the Bible. But let me say this to you all. If Jesus were a charlatan, if Jesus were not who he claimed to be, I know exactly, coming from the East, how he would have presented his resurrection. Do you know what he would have said? When I die, I will spiritually rise again. That's what he would have said, because you could never falsify that. But that's not what he said. He said, I will bodily rise again, which means he made an empirically verifiable claim that, if not true, could be falsified. That's how strong the Christian faith is. But it's presented in our universities like some kind of pie-in-the-sky, by-and-by idea. One of the most famous atheistic philosophers was Anthony Flew. And you know the name, I'm sure. In the 1980s, we would spend hours studying Flew. in all of his challenges to religious ideas in general. A few short years ago, Flew passed away. Gary Habermas debated him on the resurrection issue and so on and so forth. But before he died, here's what Anthony Flew said. He said, if there is a faith in this world that is truly legitimate and coherent, it would be the Judeo-Christian worldview. But then he went on to say this, the moral explanation for humanity seems impossible without God. You cannot explain morality without a transcendent moral lawgiver. That was his first thing. So he pointed to C.S. Lewis. He said, Lewis has been the most powerful influence for moral reasoning. And he said, I find it hard to shake it off. So he renounces atheism. But then he went on to say this, in N.T. Wright's book on the resurrection, he pinpointed the two vital ideas of morality and life beyond the grave. He said, these two truths, if I could truly come to terms with them and find that gripping my soul, they would be the ultimate answer. So he suddenly moved from atheism to an agnostic or deism, but he was no longer an atheist. He said it's unsustainable. Who knows in the last moments in his silence whether he made that commitment or not. But that was the end game of an honest atheist, that atheism was an incoherent worldview. And that's what Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, said too. There are no answers in this atheistic worldview. To me, the answers of Jesus Christ are so deep and so profound. And the simple test, in the day that you eat of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, you will be as God. That test, what we did was, in taking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we became the God of God. We redefined good and evil. It is not accidental that on our mass communication machines, the bite of the apple is on the logo of most of them. And you know what the internet has done today in propagating more and more evil all around.
Well, I find that as a fabulous segue into one of the questions that I have here about technology. But before we get to that, in this room you have a number of generations that are presented. And some in this room are parents with children who are either in college, getting ready to go to college. And some in this room are young people who are pursuing their education and they're in college. Not everybody has access to the years of study and in-depth knowledge that an apologist such as yourself has. What happens and what would you suggest to families, to moms and dads, that their sophomore, junior in college is coming home with questions about their faith that are difficult to answer? Or to the college student who is sitting in a classroom and listens to someone with a PhD that is well published and thought of totally denounce the foundations of their faith? How do they address that and do it effectively?
And that's real. We see this so visible in traveling around, whether it's here or the Middle East. I'm heading to Amman, Jordan tomorrow, and I'll be speaking there in the middle of the week. And they say the highest number of atheists ever in the Middle East is being spawned right even as you and I talk, because they've given up any hope in religious answers. So let me scroll that back a little bit first. If you have only waited till they are sophomores at universities to start teaching them how to defend their faith, you have already waited too long. Start much sooner than that, because a child's intellectual ability is far greater than you and I could actually ever imagine. You know, my grandson Jude is about 8 years old, and the questions he asks are quite amazing. When he studied about slavery in school when he was 7, came back home and the tears were running down his face. And my daughter, his mother, Naomi, said to him, "What's the matter?" She said, "How did this happen? How is there so much oppression for people like this, you know?" And so she started to talk to him and started getting books of Dr. Martin Luther King and William Wilberforce and all of that. Then he looked at my daughter, Naomi, and said, "Mom, I have a friend who's come from such and such a place. Do you think he will run into problems too as he grows up?" And Naomi said to him, "Why do you ask that?" Here's what he said at age 7. My hypothesis is this.
Naomi, we're praying for you. We're praying for you, Naomi.
Where do they get that vocabulary from? They hypothesize. They think. They have theories. So the first advice I would give to you is minimize the visual viewing during the day and maximize the reading that makes the imagination more strong. You know, it is reading that stimulates the imagination, not viewing. Viewing can seduce the imagination. Reading can move you into the right kind of imagination. That's the first thing. So you start early. Talk to your children. Don't just model the Christian life. Teach them the right way. But once they get into their junior high years, you're walking through very treacherous terrain, Matt. What we have noticed in our Q&A times, in our forums with young people, 12, 13, 14-year-olds come to the microphones and they'll say something like this. Can one of you on the platform tell me why I ought not to take my life? We've heard them come right out and say that. Because I have no meaning, I have no purpose. You see why? That which is on their hips now opens up the imagination to all kinds of vile thinking that once upon a time you had to go to a certain place to procure it. Now it comes to you by the press of a button. So they've experienced so much, it has left them lonelier than before. And that loneliness drives them to emptiness and a desire to take their own lives. This is at a huge level right now. Talk to your junior highs. Spend time with them. And don't just put them down on a couch and say, now you listen to me. Go to a ball game, and in the natural walk of life, they will open up and unburden their hearts to you. They are listening to thousands of voices in their early years. They should make sure they hear your voice too. And that voice should come with love, compassion, and instruction, so that when they go into university, may I strongly recommend for you to do something. Take them to a seminar or someplace where they will be taught on what questions to expect and what attacks to expect. I was speaking recently at Summit Ministries in Colorado Springs. They do a marvelous job of preparing young people to go into university. Our own ministry does what we call a refresh program where just before they enter university, they are able to engage the questions with high-level professors who are Christians, to hear the questions and hear the answers. But these are available in other places. Encourage them to read well. And as I said, Summit does a great job of preparing people. If they can anticipate the questions, they can then be prepared for this propaganda that is going to come their way. My professor Norman Geisler used to say, atheists are better at smelling rotten eggs than laying good ones. There are really no answers that they give to you. And recently a professor from Yale, 2 years ago, wrote a book on the end of secularism, why it had failed, that it was not able to ground and anchor. Now he was trying to defend secularism, but he said we didn't do a good job. You can't do a good job if you're the random collocation of atoms. It's only if life has essential worth can you give people purpose and meaning. Otherwise, there are no answers.